In some respects, ice barriers have retained more popularity in the community versus their actual level of success they've demonstrated in any real competitive sense. Perhaps this interest stems from the sheer impact that their named extra deck monsters have had on the game, despite those extra deck monsters having non-ice barrier dependent summoning conditions. Unfortunately, the main deck monsters associated with ice barriers reminds one of the little girl pulling petals from a flower, proclaiming one card as good and the next card as bad, down the line. Overall, the main deck monsters are not nearly as powerful and game-breaking as their namesake extra deck monsters. However, this deficiency between main deck and extra deck power has not deterred some from attempting to make ice barrier decks over the years. First, it must be noted that there are 4 popular ice barrier build strategies: Gantala Rush, Dewloren Control, Dewdark Wetlands, and Rank 4 Beatdown. There is also the ability to hybridize ice barriers with pendulums like Magicians or Metaphors, but this build will not be concerned with using pendulums. Of these general build strategies, Gantala Rush involves basically summoning General Gantala and protecting him with everything you got, while riding his Graveyard Recursion effect to eventual victory by simply overwhelming and grinding down the opponent with advantage. At least that's the plan. Dewloren Control involves using Dewloren's return effect to bounce back cards like Fiendish Chain and Call of the Haunted to produce advantage and stop the opponent's plays, while allowing Dewloren's increased attack to hit over anything that can be destroyed by battle. Dewdark Wetlands simply involves using attack stall by cards like Cryomancer, allowing Dewdark to attack directly with Wetlands on the field. Finally, Rank 4 Beatdown Spam is exactly that. But most of the Rank 4 decks that try to incorporate this strategy within ice barriers do use OCG-only cards like Silent Angler, Various Sharks, and Full Armor Black-Ray Lancer. So the strategy is somewhat irrelevant to this discussion because of its TCG focus. Interestingly enough, though, with the coming release of a certain overpowered card in Vengeance, Treetoad might offer the missing piece, along with some proper deck design, to finally allow ice barriers to get a sniff of actual competitive play. Let's see how the direct support breaks down relative to the ice barrier build I like to run. The first of the 3 separate generals, Grunard, is an interesting card, for it is one of 2 main deck ice barrier monsters with actual attack power at 2800, and has an interesting effect with relation to one of the chief characteristics of ice barrier monsters. A number of lower level ice barrier monsters have effects that demand multiple ice barrier monsters being on the field. Grunard's ability to produce a second normal summon seems to play well with the advantages of having multiple monsters on the field, not only activating these effects for the lower level ice barrier monster, but also producing multiple synchro opportunities. In the past, Grunard was too much of a liability, even with a card like Magical Triangle, because of its inconsistency issues being a 2-tribute monster. But the release of a card like Tribute Burial provides another more consistent means to summon it to the field. However, the immediate and remaining problem with Grunard's effect is the lack of quality ice barrier monsters to really take advantage of that second summon. Unfortunately, in my opinion, Grunard is more of a luxury monster than anything, because of both the lack of high-quality ice barrier monsters, as well as the lack of general ice barrier recycling outside of a card like Salvage. You'll quickly run out of ice barriers in your hand to summon, or you'll have to stack your deck with so many ice barrier monsters of questionable quality that your deck just won't work well. The second general, the aforementioned Gantala, is the other monster that has actual attack power at 2700 and has a much better effect over Grunard. Instead of demanding resources from the hand, Gantala increases the probability of engaging ice barrier effects by pulling monsters from the graveyard, which is much more efficient and versatile. Unfortunately, while Gantala's effect is generally quality, the activation occurring during your end phase rather than the opponent's end phase does limit its usefulness to continuous defensive ice barrier effects like Defender and Warlock, but excludes the ability to immediately use other effects like Dance Princess, Strategist, or Spellbreaker. However, this drawback is just a small quibble. Gantala and his rush strategy does have a problem in the fact that Gantala still really is the only hitter, which creates a pressure problem with the deck due to the end phase activation of the effect, especially due to the lurking Solemn Strikes, because to really hit home, more than likely you'll have to start making some synchro plays, for you can only stall in this meta so long. Overall, though, Gantala is a quality card that I run at 1 copy. For multiple copies, without complete devotion to the rush strategy, can be dicey, and the problem with the rush strategy inherently is ice barriers don't have a great archetype-specific painful choice type card where it can dump a lot of ice barriers into the graveyard fast. Instead, you have to play around with a card like Curry Bandit if you want to go that strategy, and that can be somewhat risky. Medium of the Ice Barrier is a 2 tribute monster with only 2200 attack that is a solid card on the first turn of the duel when you're going first, but its overall value plummets after that time period if you're not running a pendulum build, for its spell trap limitation is kind of limited value after the second turn due to the general play tempo that exists in the modern meta, where a lot of people just don't sit there with cards in their hand, so that the condition of only being able to activate 1 spell or trap per turn has less value. Also, not surprisingly, a 2 tribute monster, it's difficult to get on the field when you're going second or any time beyond the first turn. Despite its innate special summon effect and control effect, overall I just think this card is too much trouble and produces too much inefficiency. The third general, Raioh, is definitely a solid choice in this current meta environment because the ability to freely negate monster effects if the opponent does not have any cards in hand, or force the opponent to discard from the hand to receive a monster effect on the field, is definitely powerful, especially for a deck that has difficulty making positives itself. Of course, as a level 6 monster, one would like more attack or defense points over the 2100 and 2300 respectively, but with such a powerful continuous effect, I'd rather have this effect than more attack or defense points. I only run 1 copy, despite wanting to run 2 some of the time, because getting them onto the field can be a little ineffective. Yugioh is a nice side deck card, for the ability to switch to a 2200 defense position upon summoning is nice, all destruction from spell and trap without an associated ice barrier partner. However, Yugioh is only a side deck monster in my book, because the depth at which opposing decks can destroy via spell and trap card effects is variant, with most being more on the lighter side than the heavier side. Instead, they focus on monster effects having the ability to destroy. Also, Yugioh might have been somewhat replaced by another newer card, which will be discussed later. Royal Knight has a rather strange effect, because nothing in the Ice Barrier archetype really cares about destroying opponents' monsters or inflicting battle damage, so the summoning of a basically target dummy of sorts to the opponent's field after this card is summoned makes little sense. Overall, Royal Knight is just a substandard monster with a kind of needless effect for the archetype and should be avoided in any build. I just do not view Samurai as a good card, for giving up the monster, in addition to a normal or special summons, for a single draw is highly inefficient. In some sense, it would have been nice to see Samurai have the Goblin effect. If it attacked, it turned itself to defense mode, and then if it was destroyed while in defense mode, you get your draw. That would have been much more effective and much more reasonable. Sadly, that's not the case. Dance Princess is an interesting card. Having the ability to bounce opponent back row significantly increases the probability of removing the ability of the opponent to stop your plays. At worst, most of the time Dance Princess is a nice bait card for Solemn Strike, Fiendish Chain, or some such similar card. However, Princess is definitely a combo card, due to it requiring another Ice Barrier monster. Thus, it's not really able to stand on its own. Fortunately, with the general searching capacity of this deck, running 1 copy is a viable option. However, I do not run any copies because Gantala can typically manage Mirror Force variants by staying in defense mode. But running 1 copy for those interested is definitely also a viable option. In contrast to Samurai, Strategist provides a more effective drawing potential, for discarding an Ice Barrier monster to net a draw is actually not a bad trade-off, due to the level of recursion in the deck paired with the common Ice Barrier tag team effect. In some respects, Strategist actually increases the efficiency of the deck through its discard effect, priming the graveyard with various ice barrier monsters that can later be revived in the same turn via numerous recursion options, thereby satisfying the condition for a number of ice barrier monsters of having multiple ice barriers. You have Strategist, and then you have the monster that you summon via the recursion. Overall, despite the fact that it is still a combo-dependent card, demanding cards in the hand, and is a little light on the attack power at 1600, most annoying level of attack power a monster can have, I still run 3 copies. Sacred Spirit would be interesting if there was a simple way to reuse its effect, but there is not, so its overall usefulness is limited, especially since hand return is not as desirable in the current meta as it once was. Pilgrim is a middle-of-the-road stall card, but with only 1500 attack, it leaves a rather meaningful gap in its protection, as 1600 to 1850 attack monsters are not uncommon in the competitive play, ranging from either meta decks to quality rogue decks. The biggest problem with Pilgrim, though, is it does not really advance the field in any real positive manner for the player, and in this day and age of Yu-Gi-Oh! There are just better stall choices, both within this archetype itself and in general. 0 copies. Numbing Grub is basically a throwaway card for any combos are just too involved to be meaningful. Skip it. Spellbreaker is another potentially powerful card in the Ice Barrier arsenal due to its ability to eliminate spell use until the end phase of the player's next turn. Unfortunately, Spellbreaker's effect is tied to its remaining presence on the field rather than creating some form of condition, basically meaning that it commonly needs support due to its low attack power, because most of the time it will be hitting the field and activating its effect initially on the first time because you normal summoned it. Also, its effect does give the opponent the first opportunity to use spell after the end phase of your next turn. But the general workaround is simply remove Spellbreaker from the field via some extra deck play. Overall, Spellbreaker can be an interesting choice, but not one I choose to run. Shock Troops was once the hot tech card for its use against Necroz, especially a Djinn releaser-empowered Necroz monster. However, when Necroz was abandoned by a vast majority of players, Shock Troops disappeared from side decks. Interestingly enough, it may see a comeback of sorts in the near future with the arrival of Tree Toad. However, as it currently stands, Troops is just not good enough for the main deck. 0 copies. Geomancer is one of many forms of stall cards in this archetype, and is a rather substandard one at that. Skip it. Warlock is a monster version of Anti-Spell Fragrance that requires a partner. Unfortunately, its stats are so bad that unless it's paired with a protection card like Defender, it will be removed from the field rather quickly. However, this card in combination with Dance Princess can make a rather nasty combination for your opponent. Overall, though, Warlock is a little too involved versus just simply running an anti-spell fragrance itself, if you want to go that direction. Defender is probably the best monster-based stall in the Ice Barrier lineup, with no real attack holes when it is in face-up defense position, barring your opponent doing something warky like running Injection Fairy Lily. And its 1600 attack limit protects a lot of other monsters as well, including the generals. As a tuner, Defender also opens up some nice synchro plays as well when the time calls for it. The one drawback is it requires a partner to apply its effect, and it only has 200 attack points, making it a little risky to normal summon. Less risky in this build, though. However, Defender is still quality class for this deck. I run 3 copies. In a world before XZ monsters, Cryomancer's stall effect was much more effective, especially due to its reasonably high attack power for a level 2. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case. However, as a level 2 Aqua Tuner, Cryomancer still has a place at 1 copy in my build because of its ability to engage in some rather useful extra deck shenanigans, and its stall effect is still meaningful despite the XZ weakness. 1 copy. Dewdark is a specialist monster for those Ice Barrier decks that want to go low level and take advantage of the Wetlands field spell. For any other Ice Barrier deck, it is basically a throwaway, as Cryomancer is a better level 2 tuner for if those characteristics are desired. I don't run Wetlands, so no copies of Dewdark for me. Prior is the best support card in the Ice Barrier archetype, with the innate ability to special summon itself to help make XZ plays rather easily, especially in the near future when Tree Toad becomes available, and lower level synchro plays, and the ability to tribute itself to summon any Ice Barrier from the graveyard, including level 4 or lowers, after special summoning itself. Its versatility is high quality. The level restriction only applies when it special summons itself. You can still summon this card with something like Surface, and then use its effect to bring out one of the generals. Run 3 copies regardless of the build strategy. Secret Guards is another borderline main deck choice and frequent side deck choice. The ability to mitigate opponent monster effects is definitely useful at times. However, unlike Daisojo, monster targeting is much more popular in the current meta, from alternative Blue Eyes, Dark Destroyer, Kirin, and the soon-to-arrive ABC Dragon Buster. I like running 1 copy of Secret Guards. Both level 1 monsters are rather unimpressive in my opinion. Caravan is annoying because your opponent also gets the draw, and returning Ice Barriers to the deck is not really advantageous and most of the time can be detrimental. Blizzard is a rather weak card that does little to help, largely because the game now is so fast. If you're counting on one of these guys getting destroyed by battle to produce any real advantage, then your current game is in some serious trouble. If this card could special summon itself, then maybe it could have been useful as a level 1 type of bridge card for certain synchros, but it can't, so skip it. There really is not much to say about the 4 big synchros that has not already been said by numerous other people. I run 1 copy of Trishula, 1 copy of Gungnir, and 1 copy of Dewloren. Magical Triangle is an interesting card because at its heart, it is a +1, allowing you to special summon a high-level monster from the hand, as well as destroy an opponent's card. However, similar to Medium, the value of Triangle drops rather rapidly as the duel progresses. While thanks to a card like Salvage, the overall activation condition is not that difficult to achieve, although having a Salvage in hand is never a guarantee, overall in a lot of respects, Tribute Burial really just replaces this card, for its overall consistency and efficiency supersedes Magic Triangle's destruction ability. Realistically, for those wanting to run large Tribute Ice Barrier decks, just run Tribute Burial instead. Medallion is a standard search card for any Ice Barrier monster. 3 copies are required for any deck build. Mirror was another tech card that was popular when Nekroz was terrorizing the meta due to the effect of Nekroz of Trishula. Similar to Stormtroops, once Nekroz disappeared, Mirror, its job apparently done, also left the side decks of almost all players. However, with ABCs set to pick up the Trishula Banishing Torch in the TCG in the very near future, the idea of siding Mirror once again has started creeping back into the minds of some players to act as a form of hedge. The side deck is the right spot for Mirror, as it is a counter card that does not help directly advance the winning condition for the deck. For the remainder of the monsters, I like running 3 copies of Graydle Eagle to help turn the tide of battle by stealing the opponent's best monster that can be targeted. Eagle is definitely an important card for the competitive capacity of this deck. For the general spells, I run 1 Raigeki for obvious reasons, 1 copy of Soul Charge for mass summoning and playmaking, although it is not as important in this deck as it seems to be for others in my experience. Also, further tapping into the power of water, I run 1 copy of Instant Fusion for Norden access. I run 2 copies of Surface, which might as well be a Monster Reborn for a vast majority of the monsters in this deck. I run 1 copy of Foolish Burial to get my tributes into the graveyard so Prior can revive them, or something else that can be brought back by Surface. 1 card that is missing, that might surprise some people, is Salvage. The concern I have running Salvage in this build is that Surface does its job just better. I would run a 3rd copy of Surface before any copies of Salvage. In this deck build, there are no level 4 or higher and 1500 or lower attack monsters, so Salvage grabs nothing that Surface can't just simply summon from the graveyard to the field. The only advantage of Salvage in this deck is you can add discard material for Strategist, and that aspect is not valuable or consistent enough in my eyes and experience to warrant running Salvage. I think Surface is just the better card for this particular deck. For draw power, I like running 1 copy of Upstart Goblin. and 3 copies of Pot of Duality. Some may question the utility of Pot of Duality in this deck due to the special summoning restriction, reducing the ability to consistently put multiple ice barriers on the field in the same turn. While this is a valid point, in my experience, the card access ability of Pot of Duality helps much more than its special summoning restriction hurts, because this deck can draw not necessarily bad, but just not useful at times, and Pot of Duality helps those situations. Also, I run 1 copy of Moon Mirror Shield, because this deck needs the attack power help at times, and Gantala summoning can make up for the lost draw when you decide to return it to the top of your deck. Finally, closing out the spells, I run what I feel to be an incredibly important continuous spell for this deck that I think a number of people have just forgotten it exists in the first place because of the archetype it belongs to, Aquarium Stage. Stage protects all water monsters from destruction by battle against non-water monsters. This effect greatly increases the probability of placing multiple ice barriers on the field, for the inability to use battle destruction to remove monsters will significantly hurt the opponent's momentum and increase ice barrier utility. If the opponent destroys Stage, it's not that big of a deal, because the controller gets to summon a free Aqua monster from the graveyard, which represents a fair number of the smaller leveled monsters in this deck, including Prior, which then basically nets you a special summons, and Defender, which can create another form of attack lock for the opponent to deal with. In addition, you can also choose to nuke Aquarium Stage yourself to get that search, which is common strategy for a particular extra deck monster in this deck. Stage really helps Defender establish an attack lock more effectively because it allows you to summon Defender in attack mode, and while you might take some life point damage, next turn then you can safely switch that Defender in defense mode and cinch up further protection. However, it must be noted that with Stage on the field, you cannot suicide Graydle Eagle into another monster to steal that monster unless it is water, because otherwise it will not be destroyed by battle and you'll just take needless life point damage. Finally, for the traps, I run 3 copies of Quaking Mirror Force, for this deck frequently has monsters on the field, limiting the usefulness of drowning Mirror Force, and for the general structure of the deck, Quaking is better than Storming because of the somewhat lack of overwhelming force to produce an OTK. Gantala's nice, but Gantala's slow. 2 copies of Solemn Strike, for Strike can better manage both ABC, Dragon Buster, and Tree Toad in the upcoming meta versus Solemn Warning. Finally, 2 copies of Powerful Rebirth over something like Call the Haunted, because Powerful Rebirth can easily bring Prior back, even can bait opponent back row, and when you bring Prior back, you can pretty much use Prior to go into anything you would have gone into for the original Call the Haunted. Prior really is your kind of Monster Reborn Call the Haunted for this deck in monster form. As well as, similar to Call the Haunted, you can bounce Powerful Rebirth back to the hand with Dewloren's effect. An interesting side deck choice for this deck is Scrum Force. Since Defender likes to be in defense position to maximize the usefulness of its attack lock, if another ice barrier is in defense position, Scrum Force can grant Magispectre-like attributes to those monsters. One nice strategy is to use Scrum Force with Defender and Gantala in defense position, using Defender's attack lock to mitigate basically any ability of your opponent to launch attacks, and Gantala's Graveyard Recursion effect to simply send wave after wave after wave of ice barrier monsters at the opponent, eventually wearing them down. The problem with this strategy is basically coming in the form of ABC Dragon Buster, and to a lesser extent the currently annoying Castel, which can sidestep Scrum Force's personal defensive capacity by spinning or banishing it instead of destroying it, leaving the defense position ice barrier monsters exposed to being destroyed and targeted once again by opponent's card effects. However, Scrum Force can be an interesting side deck choice when not facing ABCs or something that can make rank 4s easily. Some other interesting options that I elect not to run, but might work for others, are Penguin Soldier, which can be annoying as heck for the opponent when Stage is on the field, for Soldier can simply bounce back the opponent's monster, bounce itself back to the hand, with rather nice consistency, dealing with annoying opponent threats. Also, Barrier Statue of Torrent is always a nice option as well, especially when combined with a card like Transmodify for easy access. As mentioned earlier, in this build, Curry Bandit is also an option, but one that is similar to Medium in my mind, strong on the first turn, decent on the second turn, but significantly weaker after. In addition to the Ice Barrier Synchro monsters, for the extra deck I run 1 Elder Entity Norden, 1 Greydle Dragon. Every tuner is Aqua, and summoning this guy is at least a 2-card pop. 1 Black Rose Moonlight Dragon, 1 Black Rose Dragon, 1 Hi-Speed Chanbarider. The double attacking capacity is rather essential to ending duels quickly for this deck. 1 Bahamut Shark, 1 number 37 Hope Woven Dragon Spider Shark, one of the most underrated XZ monsters in the game, and if you're running a water deck has the capacity to make rank 4s, this card better be in it. 1 Castel, the Sky Blaster Musketeer, 1 Abyss Dweller, 1 Sky Cavalry Centuria, and come November, it will be relevant, 2 copies of Tree Toad. It is important to note that I attempted to keep this deck as ice barrier-y as possible, and did not exclusively focus on Tree Toad, because Mr. Overpowered is a nice additional piece to the deck, but should not be the focal point. If you want to focus on Tree Toad, both Frogs and Paleozoics are far better choices to run. Overall, Ice Barriers have some nice strengths, being able to produce a quality stall board with semi-lock options even without putting Tree Toad on the field. Prior is a fantastic card that can produce numerous levels of versatility, and the 2 playable generals do very nice work on the field. Not surprisingly, there are some problems with the deck, largely stemming from around the fact that the deck is slow. Despite searchers like Medallion, revival cards like Surface and Prior, and a boss like Gantala, the deck does not produce easy pluses, for even summons off Gantala still have a turn delay before they can actually really start doing something. Also, the lack of speed and the general effects of the main deck monsters forces the deck to be a more stall than counterattack type of deck, which is not a great play strategy in the modern meta. Finally, the stall does not involve opponent card loss, where you're flat out just negating cards, but opponent card inactivation, where they're just choosing not to activate it because they can't, which does not force the opponent to lose resources while attempting to break the board. Instead, it creates a resource glut. In a sense, Tree Toad is a new X factor for the deck because it can be summoned with or without Bahamut Shark, and with other Aqua monsters in this build, it does not need to tribute itself to negate cards. Are Ice Barriers competitive? Against the right decks, they can be. But not surprisingly, don't expect them to top any YCSs anytime soon, even with the availability of Tree Toad. Well, that is my Ice Barrier deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.